We have Eva Burk coming up. She grew up practicing her Danaka, Koyakon, and Lower Tanana Dene Athabaskan's traditions of harvesting salmon, moose, waterfowl, berries, and trapping from her ancestral lands and waters. Her family lived a semi-nomadic lifestyle along the Tanana River and eventually settling in Nenana to attend school. Eva Dawn earned a BS from the University of Alaska Fairbanks in civil engineering, worked for the ASRC Energy Services as a senior project engineer, specializing in infrastructure, environmental studies, logistics, stakeholder engagement, and renewable energy through 2013. Currently, she's working on her Master's of Science in Natural Resources and Environment with a focus on healing through food and culture. To transition into her new career, she spent the last few years volunteering and working for her village as a wellness and culture camp leader, a fisher, cook, and laborer. Eva is dedicated to improving food sovereignty and security and community well-being through maintaining traditional lifestyles, advocacy, and opening educational spaces on ancestral lands. Please welcome Eva Dawn Burk.
She's a little bit taller than I. Duenda and Nizoon, Eva Dawn Burk's Uzer, Takatili to O, Malak the Neck, Kana Eswana. I'm Eva Dawn. I'm from Nenana in Manly Hot Springs and really grew up out on the land along the Tanana River. And there we go. The change, right? We're all here talking about the change, like changes that are happening, changes we want to see happening. I also work for the University of Alaska Fairbanks as a graduate research assistant, and they won't even let me stay in one department. They're like, we want you over at Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy, we want you over here in One Health, we want you over here in College of Rural and Community Development. So I kind of work a lot across into departments at UAF. And then I also own a small business, Rock Crossing Consulting. But the big change I want to talk about in this picture is these are my grandmothers. That's my dad's mother on the left, and her grandmother, Eva Roberts, Eva Bob, who I'm named after. She came down from the Kobuk Valley. I learned from Princess's mom. And at this time in this picture, this was October 1945, and kings were still coming in our river. So those of you who aren't familiar with Yukon River, we're undergoing devastating changes, and our way of life is seriously at risk. So that's why we're getting into this work of food sovereignty advocacy, but also trying to adapt. Like, we need to use what tools are out there to prepare ourselves. Next. And then you have to hit space. This is my family, my intro. There should be audio. If I knew this song, I would start it. But I'm not sure which one there. Thank you, Evelyn Alexander from Minto for that last ending. To Audrey knows that. That's me with my mullet in 1984. But I see the guys in Indiana rocking mullets. So next slide. Oh, some of my bullets didn't make it up. If you hit space, do more bullets come up? No, okay, go back. Anyways, these are kind of some of the things I'll be talking about. For some reason, we lost a little bit of formatting. But these are kind of the main issues. And a lot what we're talking about is like, how do you actually make this work happen? Kind of like the global scale, but also the local scale. So we'll just go to next. I don't think I need to really get into a lot of detail with this slide, right? So if you go to the United States Civil Rights, I think it's Commission on Civil Rights, 2018, openly admitting their failure to take care of their trust obligations. So when we talk about just transition, step one, meet those trust obligations that are outstanding because there's laws, right? How many broken treaties have our people gone through? Especially especially in the lower 48. They've really gone through broken treaties. Our foods. This land was abundant when they first got here. They really talked about the abundance of all the wild foods and how much bounty were on these lands. But then why would you treat it like that, right? So there was obviously some other thought process going on, right? And it's really interesting because, like a lot of people say in advocacy, they tell me, we've been saying these things for 50 years. And then I look at these pictures and I'm like, maybe hundreds of years, right? And then having to go full on into community organizing and full on movements and taking these stances and building messages around them. And just even the tribal ballot, I was looking up, I think that state recognition goes out to vote this fall. Am I right? Or is it, I'm still confused as whether the state recognizes us as tribes, the state of Alaska. Right? So what I did this morning is all I could find was that it's going to vote in fall. So hopefully we become recognized as sovereign nations. So next slide. A lot of the things that we're going through, I don't like to focus on the health disparities, but there's some key words that come up in sustainability science, and that vulnerability, right? We're vulnerable. No, we're not vulnerable by choice. We're vulnerable because of an inequitable system. That's where vulnerability begins. And so some of these steps we need to take, it's a little hard to see. I should have brought my laptop. But some of these steps we need to take is strengthening our reciprocal relationships. We are very strong, resilient people. We have a lot of adaptive capacity and transformability, right? And I think right now it's we're exercising our sovereignty and our self-determination. And we're doing that, and the work that we're doing is really centering well-being and Indigenous values in that work. This is what I always tell, I do a lot of work up at the Science School, and I ask this guy, why are you observing the ocean? And he said, well, I'm interested, and I work at the university, and I looked at him and I said, I'm observing this ocean, and it's not just me, it's a whole network of Indigenous people sharing observations, because our livelihood and our culture and our way of life is tied to observing these changes. So scientists don't hold the key in observing our changes. We need to be the frontline leaders in that. and that we're doing this with advocacy and resistance. Like I often find myself in the university where they're like, Eva, come in and kind of play this sweet, we'll include you, we have Indigenous knowledge included, you know, we're working with Indigenous communities, but then I have to lay the hammer down. I'm like, no, I think our ideas are different. Okay, so what are your expectations or what are my expectations? And literally this lady writes, I just want to get into the community and go from there and basically cut Eva out of the project. Like literally writes this down. So I was like, cool, good luck with that. And then, you know, these systemic inequities that we're going through, you know, all of these things right here, that's trauma, right? There's this story of like a mouse going through a maze, and every time in the maze, they would spray a cherry scent and also hurt that mouse. So then the mouse developed a mechanism to deter itself every time it smelled the cherry spray. Well, they did this with the pregnant mouse. And the pregnant mouse, her babies would smell the cherry spray and still run away, even though they had never experienced direct physical pain. It was in their DNA, in their genetic memory, sorry. So, you know, that's how deep intergenerational trauma is. And so a lot of the times I think that when we're thinking about healing through food and culture, like when did we get disconnected from our food? When did we get disconnected from our culture, right? And where were we? What were we doing when those things happened? And how can we, like, you know we can't go all the way backwards, but how much of what we did before can we bring with us forward, right? These are some executive orders, but we see these, right? Like this tribal consultation one came out a long time ago. And I promise I'm going to get through some of this wordy stuff here in a second. But these are things that, like, when these types of executive orders come out, we need to make sure that we're ready, like we have an action plan. We're like, okay, what does it look like when the White House commits to elevating Indigenous knowledge and federal policy decisions? Decision making is by consensus and by voting. So if you want to elevate Indigenous knowledge, then we need to have equal number of seats, right? That's kind of an easy question to me. And then fulfilling the trust responsibility in the stewardship of federal lands and waters. You know, like there was a first slide talking about the failed trust responsibility. So that's what we need right now. Is like with the Yukon River, you know, people are like co-management. But there's nothing good about managing one species. What's good is managing an ecosystem and understanding that Indigenous people are part of that ecosystem. So if we're experiencing health disparities, then the health of the ecosystems are probably experiencing health disparities. And we're seeing that today, right? So that's the thinking and the framework that needs to move forward. So next slide. Okay, and I kind of borrowed some of this, but I thought it was really cool in kind of visualizing where we're at, right? A lot of us are here in this room either doing the solutions, partnering to make the solutions happen, dreaming of the solutions, right? The solutions have to have certain key elements, and that's protect, repair, invest, transform. And that's by working with Indigenous people, being true, equitable partners. And right now, I see some of what we're doing is like, you know, we're in this base building, this organizing, but we're pushing the narrative, right? We're pushing the narrative out there for what people need to hear, for saying, you know, it's funny when I'm in college and they try to look up what Native people are doing in academic journals. I said, well, have you ever looked at the status of tribes and climate change? Have you ever looked at the Tanana Chief's Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy? Have you ever looked at the Inuit Circumpolar Council's framework on food security? And this is a look. And I was like, and are you also paying attention to the news? Because by the time you bring in all three information sources, you're starting to realize we need to act with urgency. Like the last Arctic observing thing I did, it was observing for action. Still needing so much action. So, and then also realizing too, like we live in these cycles, even within our tribal corporations who are our landowners, even within our tribal councils who are our government and have access to a lot of the funding for our health, education, and social health and well-being. And so, you know, when we're planting this narrative and seeds, it's essential that we're talking to our leaders, because how policy is going to be developed is on the ground by talking to people. But also, the biggest thing is like keeping our leadership in place, like who should be in these key positions. And when they are in those key positions, how can we be like, hello, did you forget about this? Hello, I need this added. Hello, you know, kind of being that squeaky wheel. So that's why I feel like, you know, we need all of these pieces moving in parallel to really like shift us. And next, okay. And I didn't want to get too much into this slide because it's pretty busy and that drawing is not hard, or that drawing is hard for you to see. But really, I want you to think about this as far as thinking about, are we living by our values every single day, you know? And revaluing and re-centralizing our traditional practices. Like Delula and I knew we had, and not just Delula and I, but Lindsay and Mars and others, we knew we had this conference, but we were like, we've got to get this moose hide to a certain point or we're gonna lose it. So we, in that moment, we re-centralized and prioritized our Indigenous practices. And also like re-centralizing the practical needs of the people. When I think about regenerative economy, I'm like, what do people need to survive? What do people need to be self-sufficient, to be less dependent? That's what I think of. And I look to the lands with loving and relational creativity. You know, before there were all these tools or materials or whatnot, you know, I was raised in the woods where we looked around us and we built what we needed from what was available. We harvested the food from around us from what was available by season. We understood the plants, the timing of the harvest plants, what each plant could do, what each tree does in its role. So that's really important to be in connection with place, in understanding the power of our natural resources, and not trying to dominate them. Really, and the other key point of this is, you know, that false narrative of economic growth. Like, it's all based on natural resources. So, like, you don't have infinite natural resources. So, sorry to put that on this side. So, if you don't have infinite natural resources, you need to put a cap on your use, right? You need to start reusing things. So, like, if I go to a village, the first thing I do is inventory, or to a campsite, I just go through every single little thing in that camp. And what can I use it for? What can it be repurposed for? And my dad calls me Grandma Eva all the time. That's how you do it, you know? And I think another thing too, in this economic ideas, like what I've been realizing working with the team is, by working together and doing a lot of team building, especially around Indigenous activities, we're finding out what each other's passions are. We're finding out what our God-given gifts and talents are, and how can we align these talents and make a work plan that fits us, but also takes care of our whole being and our health. Next. Okay, we're almost to the fun part. And then this, Indigenous sovereignty and opportunities, the Native American food sector, it's like the most unrealized potential in the United States. And there's a lot of ways to get there, but one is investing in capacity building. Another is tribal economic self-determination, while also thinking of ways to mitigate and adapt to climate change, right? So I'm in an area where I'm under a lot of pressure. I'm surrounded by state lands. I'll never have a rural preference. I'm looking at tools that are at the International Arctic Research Center, and it's saying how many growing days and the temperatures are going to increase, and I can kind of see that happening on my land. So as a leader in our community, and as our Indigenous people say, it's like you go and you find those tools that you can bring home to your community that make sense. And I really think for us, agriculture is one of those tools. It's hard to see what those last two jobs say, but I understand that I know just from doing this before that this has a lot to do with practicing and passing down traditional knowledge, but also that foods are so needed. Like in Alaska, our food prices are crazy. Like we really need to start learning to utilize and process and harvest some of these foods that are right here available to us. Next. Okay, and then this is regenerative economies and food systems. This is kind of like a dream by the Native American Agriculture Fund, is like creating these hub centers and then creating one in Alaska. I think there's room for multiple hub centers, not just like 10, but the key things on the side, there's some literature from NDN Collective talking about ways to make this happen. And one is not just focus on funding tribal governments, because I've been working with my tribal government for 3 years and I love them, but it'd be a lot easier if I had like a tribal conservation district, so I could carry on the good work of food and conservation and kind of keep myself separate of the politics, which change every single election. So that way I could keep this work moving without being kind of caught up in that stuff. And so that was one key thing I got, is like making sure that tribal citizens have access to this funding, because if you look across America, it's families. If you look across Alaska, it's families and people that are keeping traditions alive, so they should have that access to the capital to make it happen for themselves. And I think inherently, that's like with me, I'm like, if I'm going to do something, my whole family's going. So there's like 10, 12 of us now, and it just started off pretty quick. And then one more. So thinking of getting started, these next few slides are all pictures kind of showing about where we're at now. What I did was, I am a little bit skilled in GIS. This is not a GIS product. But what I looked at is like, okay, we have these resources. We have village corporation lands, the big chunk that says 40,000 acres, that should actually say 100,000 acres. That's the state of Alaska's ag land sale. And then we've got people in the community right there. That's our workforce. And then we've got the school system. So in Tok, they've really integrated the food right into the school system. Okay, so those are our assets and resources. How do we put it all together? Next. So also thinking about, okay, we had this idea to do agriculture. Well, we're not the only one. This is the state of Alaska planning to do a lot of work in my neighborhood. Kind of, you can see the orange hatch. If I had a pointer, it's kind of towards the middle, towards, I want to say in the lower right quadrant, right? There's like an orange hatch and a purple line that goes sideways. So not only is the state of Alaska, without tribal consultation, they want to build a road, do the ag land sale, and introduce bison into the area. And it's not to say, oh, our people are 100% against this. What we're saying is, hey, we can help this be more successful. We are real partners here. We know this land better than anybody. We have resources in the form of funds and technical capacity to help this happen. So please, instead of looking at the Wilderness Society as your partner, please look at one of our tribes as your partner. No disrespect to Wilderness Society. I love all of you. Because I know, I understand. But it's that whole of like, we need to be recognized as tribe and involved in these long-term projects which have the potential to have long-term effects on our ecological systems. I should say social ecological systems. And taking action, monitoring the environmental health. This is what Nughelnik did, kind of in a snapshot, and evaluate the governance structures around you. Like, how are your lands doing? Who gets to make all your decisions about fish and wildlife, about what gets to be built? How can you engage in those discussions? What rights do you have? Those are all things like you really need strong leadership to take those things on. And then, identify the actions and roles of Indigenous people in the local to international dialogues. So like I do a lot of work in Inanna where we have a small meeting and then we'll be over in Norway like trying to tell a lot of northern scientists about what we're going through. So we're trying to make sure a little bit of us are a little kind of everywhere, educating on colonization, its effect on behaviors. We're in the society now that's rush, hurry up, H5, got deadlines. I think my deadlines is like a dead skull and then the word lines. I was like, that's what deadlines is to me. So yeah, we have that problem. And then how do we increase opportunities for hands-on learning by building some more of these camps you're about to see? And then using our traditional knowledge and contemporary media, like making these TikTok videos, using social media, making sure that we're sharing with the world kind of like how we are resilient and nobody's gonna kill the Indian and save the man. That's never gonna happen here. So next one. So we realized in Inanna, like, look at all these words. These are actually jobs, like revitalizing local food systems. That takes a lot of work to go out and know where all the traditional harvest areas are, to know how to process the animal and not be wasteful, to know how to use all the byproducts of the animal, right? And then advocacy. I went out and started running fish wheel, and then they said, Eva, you can't run a fish wheel now. And I was like, oh yeah? Okay, I'll be at your next meeting. So then environmental stewardship, same deal. Like, how are we stepping up to take care of our lands and waters? I feel that tribal conservation districts may be a tool to help some of our villages. So next one. And that's what this is. So this is Nughelnik. They matched their boundary of their tribal conservation district to their game management unit. And the same question again, what are the individuals and families in Indigenous communities doing to revitalize and protect their local food systems? So what you're seeing when you go into these smaller communities is it's really handfuls of people that are just like so passionate to making it happen. I mean, we can see it through June, who we just heard. It's just so much passion in making it a reality, and also like aligning the resources to help that reality along. And they did this because of low salmon and moose, so they started doing things like pike removal to help the salmon habitat, increase moose browse to have the moose come closer to the village. Next one, please. And people think, why do you want to live in a village? This is why. Cool restaurants. They're very expensive. And then they'll be like, oh, you gotta work 8 to 5 to afford that meal, and maybe once a month. And then I go to my freezer and I'm like, okay. So that's why we choose to live in rural Alaska and carry on these traditions. Next one. So some of the strategies that I'm using, and we are using in Nughelnik, is to practice. Just build these places where we can practice. Increase our traditional knowledge by being in place. We have people just coming up and saying, I want to share this story with you. I want to bring this place to you, or bring you to this place. I want to teach you something. So you just kind of see it naturally happening by creating the space. And then hosting those gatherings. Like, make a gathering that's fun for people, encourage them to dress up and, play music, and also like collaborative partnerships. On the left, Calypso is helping us transplant because they realize we're still beaver trapping at that same exact time. So we're gonna adjust, but for now, this is how we're getting it done. Next slide. So that's the thing, really being aware of the seasonal calendar in what you live in, what's available, what you can harvest from the land, how do you preserve it, how do you take care of it, and also, how do you prepare? Delula, what should we have done a lot of before we tanned moose hides? Work it out, because man. So you gotta prepare for some of this, yeah. But definitely that lifestyle is like we're trying to fit agriculture into this lifestyle. For us in the interior, it works. We all have different needs in our different areas. Next slide, slide. Talking circles was a big part of everything that we did, to go over the values, to make sure people knew what we're doing for the day, to make sure our elders had the space to address us, making sure we could sit by our elders and just kind of listen to the stories. It was a really great way to start and end the day. Next slide. And then these next 5 slides are all just pictures of our work. Jarring salmon, staying up till many hours of the night, learning about this 41 quart All-American that can do 3 cases of quarts. We're buying that. So then we were trying to just make sure the kids has much exposure to traditional foods and harvesting it and processing it. Next. And then of course we are visiting from our relatives and friends across the state. We have Tia Holly, who's really doing a great job. Tia and Naomi with the Kayani sisters in Ketchikan with the Traditional Plant Symposium. We did a little bit of traditional plant work with our spruce pitch. I have a cut right now. Spruce pitch is healing it fantastically. We had our friends from Native Movement come down and we did a gudek that day with some of the white fish and berries we had. And that's what you see in the lower left. So that was wonderful. Next slide. And we're also trying to learn how to do animals. So that's some of our work at Calypso Farm. And the next slide. That's us learning how to tan hides. My son catching a beaver. Tanning hides is sort of our way of expanding our, our economy, because one hide, traditionally tanned, is very expensive. All the art you can create from one hide. So we're empowering our artists by having material for them. Next slide. Ground yourself when you're doing this activity. Always bring these people with you, your native food, your sewing, and your good friends to keep you happy. Next slide. And then this was just us, and this is why I'm a little tired and slightly off my game. That was 6 a.m. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I don't know. But yeah, we worked really hard. And make sure you have lots of mentors across the state and world. Keep it going. And who are those people? I don't even know. So I'll just leave that up there. I had a final slide, but I know I'm running over, so I'm going to